Have you ever wondered why the moments when you feel most spiritually alive are often followed by waves of intense sexual temptation? Why does it seem like the closer you get to your divine purpose, the more your body screams in the opposite direction? Here's what nobody tells you. This isn't random. This isn't the devil attacking you. This is something far more profound and terrifying. It's the self itself dismantling the false ego you've built around pleasure. Carl Jung discovered something that terrified him. The chosen ones, those marked for individuation, must face their shadow in its most primal form. Sexual desire isn't your enemy. It's the messenger carrying your soul's darkest secrets. Most spiritual teachers won't touch this topic. They'll give you surface-level advice about praying harder or avoiding triggers. But what if the very breaking of your sexual desire is actually the unconscious forcing you toward wholeness? In the next few minutes, you'll discover the hidden psychological mechanism Jung mapped and why God uses your deepest desire to shatter who you think you are. Jung noticed something disturbing in his patients who were on the verge of major breakthroughs. Right before their lives were about to change forever, they would be flooded with images, dreams, and urges they had spent years trying to suppress. The sexual impulses didn't come as whispers. They came as roaring demands that seemed to contradict everything these people believed about themselves. But here's what Jung understood that most miss entirely. These eruptions weren't obstacles to transformation. They were the transformation itself beginning to happen. Your psyche doesn't work the way you think it does. When you commit to a higher path, when you genuinely start moving toward your purpose, something ancient inside you wakes up. Jung called this the shadow, but it's more than just your dark side. It's every part of you that got buried, denied, and locked away because it didn't fit the image you needed to survive. And sexual desire sits at the very core of this buried material because it's the most powerful, most primitive force you possess. Think about what happens when you finally decide to change your life. You commit to God, to your calling, to becoming someone new, and within days, sometimes hours, you're hit with sexual thoughts so intense they make you question everything. You wonder if you're broken, if God is punishing you, if you're even capable of the transformation you felt so certain about moments before. But Jung would tell you something radical. This isn't punishment. This is your unconscious mind bringing everything to the surface that stands between you and wholeness. The shadow always speaks loudest when transformation is near, because transformation requires you to face what you've been running from. Your sexual desire, especially when it feels overwhelming and wrong, is showing you the exact places where your energy has been locked up. Every fantasy, every urge, every moment of shame is actually a map. It's showing you where your life force got trapped, where your creativity got sexualized, where your power got distorted into compulsion. Jung saw this pattern repeat in everyone who was truly called to individuation. The process of becoming whole isn't peaceful. It's violent. It's the psyche at war with itself, and sexual energy becomes the battlefield because that's where your ego has the most invested. You've built your entire identity around being good, being pure, being in control, and now the unconscious is flooding you with material that shatters that identity completely. Most people run at this point. They interpret these overwhelming urges as evidence that they're on the wrong path. They think God is testing them, or worse, abandoning them. But Jung discovered something else. The chosen ones, the ones who actually complete the journey of individuation, are the ones who can stand in the fire of their own shadow without running. They're the ones who can look at their darkest desires and ask a different question. Not why is this happening to me, but what is this trying to show me about myself? When the shadow speaks through sexual desire, it's not trying to destroy you, it's trying to integrate. Every suppressed urge is energy that belongs to you, power that got disconnected from your conscious life. And the psyche, in its wisdom, knows that you can't become whole until you reclaim all of that energy. Not by acting it out, but by understanding what it represents. Your sexual obsessions aren't about sex at all. They're about life force, creativity, and the parts of yourself you disown to become acceptable. This is why transformation feels like dying. Because the you that you've been, the identity you've carefully constructed, actually has to die for the real you to emerge. And sexual desire becomes the hammer that breaks that false self apart. It shows you that you're not who you thought you were. You're not the pure spiritual person. You're not the one in control. You're something far more complex, far more powerful, and far more real than the image you've been defending. Jung called this process the union of opposites. You can't become whole by choosing light over darkness. You become whole by allowing both to exist within you simultaneously. And nowhere is this more challenging than in sexuality, where we've been taught to split ourselves into good and evil, pure and corrupt, chosen and fallen. The breaking that God initiates through your sexual desire is actually the breaking of these false divisions. It's the psyche demanding that you stop pretending and start becoming real. This breaking that Jung described opens a door to something even more disturbing. Your sexual desire isn't just revealing your shadow. It's showing you the life you never lived. Every fantasy, every compulsive thought, every moment where your body takes over your mind is actually carrying a message about the person you could have been but weren't allowed to become. Jung called this the unlived life, and he believed it was one of the most dangerous forces in the human psyche. When you were young, you had natural urges toward creativity, expression, and power. You wanted to create, to be seen, to take up space in the world. But somewhere along the way, those urges got shut down. Maybe your family needed you to be small. Maybe your religion taught you that ambition was sinful. Maybe the world around you made it clear that your authentic expression was too much, too dangerous, too wild. So you learned to compress yourself. You learned to redirect your life force into acceptable channels. But energy doesn't just disappear. It transforms. And when your creative power, your authentic expression, and your natural drive for life get blocked, they don't go away. They go underground. They become sexualized. Jung observed this in countless patients. The artist who never painted becomes obsessed with pornography. The leader who never led becomes addicted to domination fantasies. The wild soul who was forced to be tame becomes consumed with taboo desires that seem to have nothing to do with their conscious values. Your libido, in Jungian terms, isn't just about sex. It's your total life energy. It's the force that wants to move through you and create, express, connect, and transform the world. When that force can't move in its natural direction, it becomes sexual obsession. Not because you're broken, but because your psyche is trying desperately to tell you something. Every compulsive sexual thought is actually a creative impulse that never got to live. Every fantasy is a part of your personality that got exiled. Every moment of overwhelming desire is your soul screaming that there's a life inside you that's dying without expression. This is why religious people often struggle the most with sexual temptation. It's not because they're more sinful or because the devil targets them harder. It's because the spiritual path often requires massive suppression of natural drives. You're taught to be humble, so your natural confidence gets buried. You're taught to be selfless, so your healthy self-interest gets exiled. You're taught to be pure, so your natural passion and intensity get redirected into sexual channels because they have nowhere else to go. Jung saw the devastating consequences of this in his practice. People who had devoted their entire lives to being good, to serving God, to following the rules, would reach middle age and suddenly fall apart. Their marriages would explode. Their faith would crumble. They'd be flooded with sexual desires so intense and so contrary to everything they believed that they'd question their entire existence. And Jung's response was always the same. This isn't a crisis. This is your psyche trying to save your life. By the way, if you're curious to go even deeper and integrate your shadows and light, check out the Sim Method ebook. It's a concise guide that can help you unlock your inner power in just 5 minutes a day. The link is in the first pinned comment below. Understanding that your sexual obsessions carry your unlived life brings you to the most terrifying part of this journey. The person you think you are has to die. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but in a way that feels absolutely real in your body and mind. Jung called this the death of the ego, and he was clear that it wasn't optional for those called to become whole. Your false self, the carefully constructed identity you've worn like armor your entire life, must be dismantled piece by piece. And sexual desire becomes the weapon that does the dismantling. Your false self was built for survival. It was the version of you that could be loved by your parents, accepted by your community, and approved by your God. Every time your authentic impulses rose up and were rejected, you learned to hide them. Every time your real feelings were too much for others to handle, you learned to suppress them. Layer by layer, year by year, you built a personality that could navigate the world safely. And at the core of this false self is the belief that if people knew who you really were, they would abandon you. Sexual shame is the cornerstone of this false identity. From your earliest memories, you learned that certain parts of your body were bad, certain thoughts were evil, certain desires were unforgivable. You learned to split yourself into the presentable self that goes to church, goes to work, and interacts with family, and the hidden self that emerges in the dark, in secret, in moments of weakness. Jung understood that this split is what makes people sick. You cannot be whole while maintaining this division, and your psyche will do whatever it takes to force integration. When God breaks you through sexual desire, what's really happening is that your psyche is refusing to maintain the lie anymore. The energy required to keep your shadow locked away, to maintain the performance of purity, to pretend you're someone you're not, eventually becomes unbearable. And the unconscious, in its infinite wisdom, begins flooding you with exactly the material you've been most afraid of. Not to torture you, but to show you that the thing you've been running from is actually the key to your freedom. This death feels catastrophic because everything you've based your worth on gets stripped away. You realize you're not the good person you thought you were. You're not in control like you believed. You're not spiritually advanced just because you can quote scripture or follow rules. All of those achievements, all of those carefully maintained appearances, all of that performance, none of it protected you from your own nature. And in the moment when your sexual desire overwhelms your ability to suppress it, you see yourself clearly for the first time. You see the human animal beneath the spiritual costume. Jung insisted that this moment of seeing was essential. You cannot integrate what you cannot acknowledge. You cannot become whole by continuing to pretend that half of yourself doesn't exist. The chosen ones are the people who can endure this death without running back to their old defenses. They're the ones who can sit in the ashes of their false identity and resist the urge to immediately rebuild it. Because rebuilding too quickly means you'll just create another false self, another prison, another version of the lie. This is why the breaking through sexual desire is so effective. Sexuality touches every part of your identity. It connects to your relationship with your body, your relationship with power, your relationship with shame, your relationship with God, your relationship with other people. When your sexual shadow erupts, it doesn't just challenge one aspect of who you are, it challenges everything. Your entire worldview has to be reconsidered. Every belief you held about good and evil, pure and impure, saved and damned, all of it becomes questionable. Most people experience this death as a crisis of faith. They think they're losing God when actually they're losing their childish image of God. They think they're falling away from truth when actually they're falling away from the simplified version of truth they needed when they were younger. Jung called this the religious crisis of the second half of life, and he saw it as absolutely necessary. You cannot mature spiritually while clinging to a God who only loves the parts of you that are acceptable. You have to discover a God who can hold all of you, including the parts you've been taught to hate. The false self dies slowly and painfully. Every time you're flooded with sexual thoughts that contradict your spiritual identity, another piece of the old you crumbles. Every time you fail to maintain your purity, another brick in the prison wall falls. Every time you're forced to admit that you're not who you pretended to be, more space opens for who you actually are. This process feels like punishment, like God has turned his face away from you. But Jung would tell you that God is actually closer than ever. The real God, not the one your false self invented, is present in the breaking itself. Once the false self begins to crumble, you're left standing in the rubble with a question that changes everything. What is this sexual obsession actually trying to tell me? Jung spent his entire career helping people decode the language of the unconscious, and he discovered that sexual imagery is never just about sex. Every fantasy, every compulsion, every overwhelming urge is symbolic. It's your psyche speaking in the only language powerful enough to get your attention. When you find yourself obsessed with a particular sexual scenario, Jung would ask you to stop judging it and start examining it. What does this fantasy give you that your real life doesn't? If you're drawn to images of domination, what part of your life feels powerless? If you're obsessed with scenarios of being desired, where in your life do you feel invisible? If your fantasies involve breaking rules or crossing boundaries, what authentic part of yourself have you imprisoned behind rules that don't actually serve you? Your sexual obsession is a mirror, but most people are too afraid to look into it honestly. They see the surface level, the explicit content, and they're so consumed with shame that they miss the deeper message. Jung understood that the unconscious doesn't speak literally. It speaks in symbols, and sexual symbols are the most potent because they carry the energy of life itself. Your compulsive thoughts aren't random. They're precisely calibrated to show you exactly what your conscious mind has been refusing to see. For many people, sexual obsession reveals a hunger for aliveness that's been starved out of their daily existence. You go through the motions of your life, doing what's expected, following the script, maintaining the performance. But underneath, you're dying of boredom, dying of containment, dying of living a life that's too small for your soul. And your sexual desire erupts as a rebellion. It's your psyche's way of saying that you need more life, more passion, more reality, more truth. The obsession isn't about the sexual act itself. It's about the intensity, the aliveness, the feeling of being fully present in your body and your experience. Jung also recognized that sexual obsession often reveals relationship to power. When you examine your fantasies without judgment, you might notice patterns. Are you always the one in control or always the one surrendering control? Are you drawn to scenarios where you're worshipped or scenarios where you're degraded? These patterns aren't accidents. They're showing you how you relate to power in every area of your life. If you're constantly drawn to fantasies of domination, your psyche might be showing you that in your real life, you've given away too much power. You've become too compliant, too nice, too accommodating. Your sexuality is trying to compensate for what your conscious life has denied. The opposite is also true. If your fantasies involve submission or degradation, Jung would ask you to consider where you're carrying too much responsibility, where you're trying too hard to control everything, where you're exhausted from always having to be strong. Your sexual shadow isn't encouraging you to act out these scenarios. It's showing you that your psyche needs balance. You need to find healthy ways to surrender, to trust, to let go of the crushing weight of always being in charge. Another common pattern Jung observed was the way sexual obsession reveals our disconnection from the body. People who live entirely in their heads, who've been taught that the body is shameful or unimportant, often develop intense sexual compulsions. It's the psyche's desperate attempt to reconnect with the physical, animal, embodied reality of being human. Your fantasies aren't pulling you away from spirituality. They're trying to ground your spirituality in actual incarnation. You can't become whole by transcending the body. You become whole by fully inhabiting it. For those who were raised with strict religious teachings, sexual obsession often reveals the lie of perfectionism. You were taught that holiness means never struggling, never doubting, never feeling what you feel. And your sexual shadow erupts to show you that this standard is not only impossible but destructive. Your fantasies, especially the ones that horrify you most, are proof that you're human. They're not evidence of your unworthiness. They're evidence that you're alive, that you're real, that you're far more complex than the simplified version of yourself you were taught to perform. Jung would also point out that sexual obsession frequently masks grief. When you've lost connection to something essential in your life, when you've buried dreams or abandoned callings or compromised yourself beyond recognition, that loss has to go somewhere. And it often goes into sexuality because sexual energy is the closest thing your body has to pure life force. Your obsessive thoughts might actually be your psyche trying to feel something, anything, in the face of a life that's gone numb. The compulsion isn't about pleasure. It's about trying to convince yourself you're still alive. Everything you've learned so far brings you to this moment, the moment when understanding isn't enough anymore. The moment when insight doesn't stop the compulsion. the moment when you know intellectually what your sexual obsession represents, but you're still drowning in it. Jung called this the dark night, and he warned that it was the most dangerous part of the journey. This is where most people give up. This is where the pain of transformation becomes so intense that running back to the old life seems like the only option. You're standing in the ruins of your false self, fully aware that your sexual desire is carrying messages from your unlived life, and yet the urges keep coming. They don't stop just because you understand them now. In fact, they often intensify, because your psyche isn't satisfied with intellectual understanding. It wants embodied transformation. It wants you to actually change your life, not just think about changing it. And when you resist that deeper change, when you try to manage your shadow instead of truly integrating it, the pressure builds to unbearable levels. This is the hour when people make catastrophic choices. They've held on for so long, fought so hard against their desires, maintained such rigid control, that when the dam finally breaks, it breaks completely. Marriages explode, careers end, reputations crumble, all because the psyche, when ignored long enough, will force the issue. Jung saw this pattern repeatedly. The people who refused to consciously integrate their shadow ended up having it erupt unconsciously in ways that destroyed everything they'd built. But for the chosen ones, the ones truly called to individuation, this dark hour serves a different purpose. It's not the end. It's the chrysalis. You're being held in unbearable tension because something new is trying to be born, and birth is always violent. Your old strategies for managing your sexuality don't work anymore. Prayer doesn't take away the urges. Willpower doesn't last. Shame doesn't motivate change. Every tool you've relied on to keep yourself in line has been stripped away. And in this nakedness, this absolute vulnerability, this total loss of control, the possibility of real transformation finally opens. Jung understood that the psyche breaks us open in the places where we're most defended, because those are the places where we're most false. Your sexual obsession has become unbearable because you've been using enormous amounts of energy to keep it contained. And that energy is needed elsewhere. It's needed for the life you're actually called to live. The breaking isn't meant to destroy you. It's meant to free that energy so you can finally use it for what it was always meant for. This darkest hour asks a question that only you can answer. Are you willing to stop fighting and start listening? Are you willing to let your sexual desire teach you instead of trying to conquer it? Are you willing to trust that the force tearing you apart might actually be the same force trying to make you whole? Most people can't say yes to these questions. The fear is too great. The risk of truly changing feels more terrifying than the pain of staying stuck. But something shifts when you finally surrender. Not surrender to the compulsion, not acting out the fantasies, but surrender to the process itself. When you stop trying to control the outcome and instead become curious about what's happening, the quality of your experience changes. The sexual urges don't necessarily disappear, but they lose their tyrannical power over you. You can observe them without being consumed by them. You can feel them without believing you have to do anything about them. Jung called this the transcendent function. It's the moment when you can hold two opposite truths simultaneously. You can acknowledge your sexual desire and also acknowledge your commitment to a different path. You can honor the message your sexuality is bringing while also choosing not to act on it in destructive ways. This isn't repression. Repression is pretending the desire doesn't exist. This is integration. Integration is allowing the desire to exist while you consciously choose what to do with it. The darkest hour is when your ego finally accepts that it's not in charge. Your willpower, your good intentions, your spiritual disciplines, none of them can manufacture wholeness. Wholeness comes from the self, from that deeper organizing principle that Jung spent his life trying to understand. And the self uses whatever means necessary to bring you into alignment with your true nature. If sexual desire is what it takes to break your ego's stranglehold on your life, then sexual desire is what you'll experience, not as punishment, but as medicine. After the darkest hour comes something unexpected. Not relief exactly, but recognition. You begin to recognize that the energy that was tearing you apart is the same energy that can make you whole. Jung called this the transformation of libido, and it's the final stage of the journey for those who don't give up. Your sexual energy doesn't disappear. It doesn't get conquered or transcended. it gets redirected into its original purpose, which was never just about physical pleasure or reproduction. It was always about creation, about bringing new life into the world in whatever form that takes for you. This redirection doesn't happen through force. You can't willpower your way into transforming your sexual energy into creative energy. It happens naturally when you finally stop splitting yourself in half, when you stop trying to be the pure spiritual person who has no body and the hidden sexual person who has no soul. When you allow these two aspects to meet each other, something alchemical occurs. The energy that was trapped in obsession and compulsion suddenly becomes available for the work you're actually here to do. Jung saw this transformation in his patients who completed the journey of individuation. The artist who had been paralyzed by sexual shame suddenly found himself creating prolifically. The leader who had been secretly consumed by taboo fantasies suddenly stepped into authentic authority. The spiritual seeker who had been tormented by desire suddenly discovered a depth of compassion and wisdom that could only come from knowing both the highest and lowest parts of human nature. Their sexuality didn't disappear. It integrated. What does integration actually look like? It looks like being able to feel sexual desire without being controlled by it. It looks like acknowledging your fantasies without shame and without the need to act on them. It looks like recognizing that your body's urges are information, not commands. It looks like understanding that you're a complex being with physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual dimensions, and all of them deserve acknowledgement. You don't become less sexual. You become more honest about your sexuality and more intentional about what you do with that energy. For many people, this integration brings a surprising discovery. The sexual energy that felt so dark and overwhelming actually contains tremendous creative power. When you stop condemning it, stop fighting it, stop trying to eliminate it, you can start working with it. You can feel the surge of desire, and instead of immediately trying to satisfy it or suppress it, you can channel it into your work, into your art, into your relationships, into your purpose. This isn't sublimation in the Freudian sense, where you're just redirecting frustrated desire. This is recognition that sexual energy and creative energy are the same energy, just expressing itself in different ways. Jung also discovered that integrated sexuality brings depth to spiritual life. The people who had faced their shadow and survived, who had looked at their darkest desires without running, who had allowed their false self to die. These people developed a relationship with the divine that was rooted in reality rather than fantasy. They stopped needing God to be comfortable. They stopped needing spirituality to be pretty. They could hold the paradox of being deeply flawed and deeply loved, deeply human, and deeply connected to something greater than themselves. This is the rebirth that justifies the breaking. You emerge from the darkest hour not as a perfected version of yourself, but as a whole version of yourself. You're no longer at war with your own nature. You're no longer split between the presentable self and the hidden self. You're integrated, which means you're real. And from that realness comes a kind of power that the false self could never access. Because when you're not using all your energy to maintain an image, to control your desires, to perform holiness, that energy becomes available for actual transformation in the world. The chosen ones, the ones who survive this journey, carry a particular kind of authority. It's not the authority of perfection or purity. It's the authority of someone who has been to the underworld of their own psyche and returned. They can speak about struggle without shame. They can acknowledge darkness without being consumed by it. They can hold space for others who are going through their own breaking because they remember what it felt like to be torn apart. Their sexuality is no longer their master or their shame. It's simply one aspect of their complex humanity integrated into the larger purpose of their lives.